what happens was the main event in the 15th century, the discovery of America.
Right.
So we have the main figure, who is Francisco de Vitoria, and then around him there are other theologians, other jurists, also Dominicans, and then later the Jesuits will also participate in what we understand by the School of Salamanca. So those are the main forces, the Dominican theologians and jurists and the Jesuits. Crucial, and they deal with everything and anything because of that understanding of human relations, how we relate to each other, and when it comes to dealing with law, international law, trade, usury, it's immoral. It deals with marriages, it deals with human rights, and then Francisco de Vitoria and others, they say you cannot take the land or the property of these Indians. They are entitled to that. Francisco de Vitoria is mentioned in the founding documents of the United Nations because he's considered as the father of international human rights and also international law and international trade. To talk about the School of Salamanca, and we're going to learn what is it, what is the School of Salamanca, and where is Salamanca, and why do we call it the school, and why is it important, why those professors, those theologians, these scholars, the scholastics are important, and why were they important in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century, and what's the relevance of them today? And we can see today, we're going to talk about how the main ideas that we deal with today in the 21st century, we drink from the sources and the debates that they were already having and the teaching they were giving in the 16th century. So what is the School of Salamanca? Where is Salamanca? Where is Salamanca?
Salamanca is a place in
Spain. So it's a university, well, it's a city, but when we talk about the School of Salamanca, it's named after the university. And it's in the kingdom of basically Castile at that time, and it's in the northern part of Spain, close to Madrid. And why is it important? The University of Salamanca, as we understand it, it was first established in the 13th century. It was the school. There was a school at that time in the 13th century. Most of these schools, which is basically the precedent of the universities as we understand them today, they originated from the cathedrals. The bishops had basically the authority and the obligation to teach, to form the priests, and obviously the cathedral being the place, the church of the bishops. So they started establishing those schools around the 13th century. And the very first universities originate thanks to the Catholic Church. They're the ones who found, as we understand them, these universities in the 13th century. Bologna was basically in Italy, now this is Italy, the first one, and then within a few years we already see the other universities being established in Spain. Salamanca was one of them. There was another one in Palencia, in the northern part of Spain. Oxford University, Paris, it was one of the most prestigious ones. Coimbra in Portugal, and many other countries in Europe. And in the 16th century, thanks to Spain and thanks to the church, they established the first university in Asia, in the Philippines. And obviously, about 27 universities, Spain established in Latin America, about 27 universities in the 16th century and 17th century. So we have this idea of this network of centers of learning, and not only just to learn about the different disciplines. At that time, they were mainly grammar, theology, law. They were the main ones. We're talking about the 13th, 14th, 15th century. And Paris was at one point in the 16th century one of the most prestigious ones because they had the ability to teach theology. And also, we're going to see that one of the main, the main figure of the School of Salamanca is the Dominican, from the Dominican order, the religious order. Obviously, he was a priest. And then his name was Francisco de Vitoria. And he's the very first person at the university who is given the right to have a chair, the chair of theology. So at that time, it's very prestigious. Why theology? So theology, when it was how they see theology is the main course, the main subject, the mother subject that influences and it gives you an understanding of what's going on in terms of morality and the relationships with humans. Why humans? Because these theologians and all these Catholic theologians, they understand the relationship as based on not only the positive law, the positive meaning that is being posited by humans, like when you are driving today, that is part of the positive law. It doesn't come from God. Or when you have an organization and you have your own bylaws, that is part of the positive law because you as individuals, you have decided, you have posited that these are the rules how we are going to ordain our behavior with each other. So that's the positive law. But then the Catholics understand these relationships as inherit of humans, which is something very different from animals. One of the things that they say distinguishes us from animals is the ability to think, to reason, to use logic, to reason, and also free will. And those are the two concepts very important in the part of the theological understanding, part of the School of Salamanca. And then that's why theology is so important, because it influences every single aspect of that relationship with other human beings. It's based on morality, ultimately to do with God. Because God creates the human freedom and how we interact with each other. And then these theologians are also, some of them are jurists. They study law, the theory of law, and how law influences every single aspect of our life. So that's why law has a moral component and an ethical component. And at that time, these theologians, and they say, well, everything we do, it has that component. And we as theologians and jurists, Catholic theologians, we have a say in that because they were at university, they were not only priests and theologians, so they had also the ability and the authority, the office to issue, well, to teach, and also the moral authority to talk about faith and morals. Now, around the 16th century, 15th century, they come across new situations. What happens was the main event in the 15th century, the discovery of America. Christopher Columbus discovers in 1492 America, and then so the Spaniards and the Portuguese, they go, and then later the English and the Dutch, they go, and the French, they come to Latin America, to the American continent, and when they face a different situation, totally. And one of the moral issues, and the Dominicans, the ones from the School of Salamanca, the university, specifically the College of Saint Stephen, which was the Dominican college, the Dominican place from where they were teaching. The issue is, okay, these Indians, how do we relate to them? Can we exploit them? So
this is one of the issues that they were debating in the School of Salamanca?
That's one of the main issues.
Was this also being debated in other universities?
Well, some of them, especially at that time, it was Spain. It was the one that was conquering, colonizing the part of Latin America, along with Portugal. Even the Pope they intervenes, and then they say there is an agreement, the famous Treaty of Tordesillas, and then they agree that from a particular line is going to be for the Portuguese to exploit, and then the rest it would be for Spain.
So I guess a contextual question I would have is, you kind of explained the history of universities across Europe in general, and so you have universities that started springing up. I know with the University of Bologna, it started in the 11th century. It's the first university
12th century, yeah,
in Europe. Now I'm just wondering, because of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, would that have disrupted the network of universities across Europe who would have been discussing these sorts of ideas? Because obviously the English approach to answering these sorts of questions was vastly different than the Spanish sort of approach to answering how to deal with the Indians.
When we talk about the School of Salamanca, we're not talking about a monolithic way of thinking.
Right.
So we have the main figure, who is Francisco de Vitoria. He's let's say, the founding figure. And then around him, there are other theologians, other jurists, also Dominicans. And then later, the Jesuits will also participate in what we understand by the School of Salamanca. So those are the main forces, the Dominican theologians and jurists and the Jesuits. Crucial. And they deal with everything and anything because of that understanding of human relations, how we relate to each other. And when it comes to dealing with law, international law, trade, money, so especially in the last century, there's been a rediscovery of some of the monetary theories of some of these theologians from the School of Salamanca, and the value of money, even the promissory notes, charging interest. Is it morally? Is it licit? Usury, is it moral? Or when are you morally? When can you charge an interest or some kind of service? Charge something. It deals with marriages. It deals with human rights. So even, for example, and some of these theologians, they write treatises. At times for confessors, because some of them, they were confessors, they were private confessors of the monarchs, and also the monarchs, such as Charles I of Spain, consults with them. We are dealing with a new situation in Latin America. What do we do? And then Francisco de Vitoria and others, they say, you cannot take the land or the property of these Indians. They are entitled to that. Even at times, they limit the power on the authority of the Pope. They say, no, the Pope has the authority on Christians and the clergy. But outside that sphere, you don't have a say. You cannot just give, you as the monarch, you don't have the authority to give a monarch more rights than the monarch might have. So they are dealing with those situations. And even as I said, to do with international trade. Francisco de Vitoria is mentioned in the founding documents of the United Nations because he's considered as the father of international human rights and also international law and international trade. Because at that time they were already establishing these foundations from a legal point of view, but also the law is very much based on morality. Can I trade with another nation? And also when it comes to for example, freedom of movement. Part of the School of Salamanca is in some countries they established some houses for beggars, for those people who were begging. And because they wanted to control that. And even to this day, we deal with the same situation. And some of these theologians are saying, no, they do have, you cannot restrict them, you cannot just put them and force them to be in one institution. They have the inherent right of movement. They can beg anywhere they want. Nowadays, we take it for granted, the freedom of movement. But to say in the 16th century, to say, okay, they are begging, but they do have the right. You don't have the moral authority to put them in an institution. If they want to beg here in the city, or if they want to beg somewhere else, they have the right. To this day, when the question we can ask, how is this relevant to this day? Well, to this day, in this city, we have the same situation with the homeless. And then even the city, when you look at the bylaws, well, it's not a bylaw. So the city is saying they do have the right, if they have an incumbent, if they want to live on the street, literally under the bridge. We don't have, the city, the civil authority, we do not have the right to take them away and to forcibly put them somewhere else. So,
and this idea comes from the School of Salamanca?
Well, the same, not necessarily, because even the people from the School of Salamanca, they are drinking from the Catholic understanding of those social relations, mainly from St. Thomas Aquinas. So St. Thomas Aquinas deals with two issues, mainly the theology in the Summa, and then there is the part of the Summa, you have the Secundes, the second part that deals with to do with the law, as we might understand nowadays, the relationships with other human beings. And then Francisco de Vitoria, going against the bylaws of the University of Salamanca at the time, it teaches St. Thomas Aquinas, and is part of the requirement to understand and to read St. Thomas Aquinas and the application of those principles. I mean, he's not the only one, but those principles. What I would say is the School of Salamanca, all these theologians and jurists, they take it further and they apply the principles, the Catholic understanding of these relationships, not only with God and morality, but also, as I said, with everybody else. They take it even further because for the first time they are facing situations that they never experienced before. For example, that international trade. Until then, it was mainly the Mediterranean. But then all of a sudden in the 16th and 17th century, they come across that there is the Atlantic, the international trade, and the Pacific. What do we do with that? And then they are dealing with people, with communities, with estates that haven't been, they were not known until then. Do we have the right to exploit them, or do we have to provide for them? Are they children of God? Do they have freedom? Or can they be made slaves?
So really what they're doing here is they're applying already established principles that were, from Aquinas and the Catholic Church on the dignity of people, and then applying it to these new sort of modern problems that they were encountering.
And then they use the logic, which is very Catholic. Even St. Thomas Aquinas uses in a very in a wonderful way that logic, in a very structured way.
Yes.
The logic. They come up with a problem, moral problem, or an issue. And actually the word problem basically means the etymology of problem, basically, that's why we talk about mathematical problems. There's you have to solve the issue to a knot. There is a knot, and how do you solve that knot? And then they come up with issues, and you think, is this a moral issue? And how do we deal with that? Here's an example. So there is another priest who writes a treaty for confessors about is it licit for tobacco and chocolate? Does chocolate and tobacco break the ecclesiastical fast? Now, obviously, before the discovery of America, there was no chocolate because chocolate comes from America. So the Spaniards bring the chocolate to the continent, to Europe, and then also the tobacco. And then all of a sudden they are dealing with this new situation. And from a spiritual point of view, and this priest says, does this new thing break the fast or not? To some extent, we are dealing with the same nowadays with other products. Even can you import this product if you are going to maybe destroy the local economy of another country, one other community? And also an important issue that deal with the School of Salamanca, the theologians, is can the state, the monarch, well, first of all, does the monarch, where does the authority of the monarch come from? And this is important because Francisco de Vitoria and others, they say, well, it's basically the people decide and this idea comes from God. Ultimately, it's not only the positive law is based on the natural law, and ultimately the natural law is based on the divine law. And then God gives you the free will, and also gives you the freedom to organize yourself as a political body. And then, in a way, how the reason is, the people have the authority, they transfer that authority, they can choose the republic, res publica, the common thing for the public, res publica, hence the word republic, or a monarchy. You can choose a monarch to represent, because you don't have the time to organize the public affairs all the time. You have a job to do, and then what you do is you delegate that authority to somebody who might represent you. And then you as a community, even to this day, for example, a few years ago, back in the United Kingdom, the police were saying, no, we are policing because we have been by delegation. We don't have the authority. It's the people who have the authority, and then they delegate that authority to us. And then the idea of the monarch is very much the same. The way some of these theologians look at it is the monarch has been established by the community, ultimately determined by the people, and ultimately it comes from God, the authority to decide who to choose. And even some of these theologians are saying, if the monarch, the ruler, is a tyrant, they have the right to depose the tyrant. If the law is unjust, you have the right, individually as a community, you have the right, the moral right, not to follow that unjust law, which even to this day, when you open the newspaper or the things that you deal with, you also deal with the same situation. Also, another topic.
I guess that's why it's important to know Thomas Aquinas' Summa, because it talks about a lot of those topics as well. And I could see how that would be a central point of study for the School of Salamanca, where they're talking about laws and morals.
We need to know where these ideas come from, and even at that time they are saying, okay, can the monarch, the state, nowadays, the state have the authority to tax? Can you tax, and especially can you tax goods that you need? The wheat, at that time, the wheat, because without wheat you cannot have bread. Do they have the authority to tax? Or not?
Income tax.
It's the same idea.
Yeah.
Now, and then the principle is, well, it's for the common good. But then you also have the right, they always talk about that, the right to private property. And also, can the state, at that time it would have been the monarch, the absolute monarch, but now there's the state, do they have the right to expropriate your property? Do you have the authority to maybe injure somebody? Do you have the authority to trade with somebody? And the idea of the trade, especially when nowadays a lot of people, a lot of economists, they talk about the School of Salamanca, they look at the School of Salamanca from the commercial point of view, the trade point of view. And the Catholic understanding of the trade is, yes, you have the freedom, you have the right to trade with whoever you want. But provided, even to this day, the law says, provided that is just and fair. You're not going to exploit somebody. Although they say you can have some kind of a compensation. For example, if I'm going to give you money and I say to you, you have to give me this loan back, the money I'm lending you, you have to give it back to me by next month or next year. And if you don't, then I'm going to lose out because I would need that money to provide that service and for something else. And then they say, well, the School of Salamanca, some of them from the School of Salamanca are saying, in that case, yes, you do have the right to charge, to say, if you don't pay me back on the day that we said, in a way, is it interest? It's sort of a gray area, but the idea is morally, ethically, you can't charge that person because otherwise you might be losing out. Also, they say you do have the right to charge. We're not talking about usury in this right now.
Right.
We're talking about charging, for example, if there is a risk. If I'm going to spend my money, I'm going to invest that money in a very risky enterprise. For example, at that time it was paying for the shipment or to build a ship that was going to go to Latin America, and it was going to be destroyed by a storm or kidnapped by pirates. Well, it's much riskier than if I lend the money to my neighbor that I see every day and I can. So in that case, they say morally, yes, it's permitted to charge some kind of interest.
So you're saying that speculative investing is not just a modern
They talk about
idea?
that, and that's why a lot of economists, they talk about, again, international trade and the value of money and promissory notes and even inflation. That's why it's very current. There are more than 25,000 papers and conferences and lectures devoted now to the School of Salamanca. They have been rediscovered. Mainly it was in the 20th century that quite a few academics and intellectuals and economists, they realized that there was a whole wealth of understanding of economy and other issues. Even as I said, the United Nations, they mentioned Francisco de Vitoria, and then they were rediscovered. Some people might say, well, they were not that well known for quite a few centuries because historically in Europe, Spain was the main power until the 18th century. And if anything came from Spain and the Catholic Church, then the rest of the sort of, especially coming from the Protestant Europe, they were suppressing anything that came from Spain and the Catholic Church. So in many occasions, they use the ideas, the principles, the moral principles, the theological arguments, even for the monetary theory, but without quoting, without mentioning that these ideas came from the Catholic Church, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, and the School of Salamanca from Spain. So the important thing is, as I said, even to this day, we have the same debate. We have here in Canada, we have just been introduced a carbon tax. So what the School of Salamanca discussed in the 16th, 17th century, mutatis mutandis, the same principle applies to this day in Canada or in other countries. Can the state have the authority, and also is it moral to charge a tax on goods and services that you need for living, because you cannot live without electricity or natural gas nowadays? So are they morally allowed to do that? Here in Canada, it's a different topic, because at times the provinces, they have their own parliaments, they decide, and they say, no, you, the federal government, is not your jurisdiction. It's our jurisdiction. We have the power. And also you might justify, well, it's for the common good. But other people might say, actually, no, because you are taxing something that I need. Without it, I cannot live without. It's a bit like in some countries, they do not tax, for example, the basic goods, food. Food, even here, is not taxed because it's considered that people need it to live on and to survive. These ideas, these concepts come from the School of Salamanca, because they are already, they developed those concepts at that time. So that's relevant. Even in international trade, can I go to another country? Even the concept, very important and is relevant to this day, is when can you declare war? When is it permissible? So Thomas Aquinas
so they talk about just war.
Yes, and it's called just war. When is war just or justified? And then they already say that, well, based on St. Thomas Aquinas, it's this Catholic understanding that it's not just because on a whim I decide to attack somebody. It has to be certain conditions. Yes. And especially when the population is suffering at the hands, for example, of the ruler, or when another country has been attacked, another community has been attacked. And then there are certain rules that the Catholic Church in medieval times imposed. It's called the peace of God. And then they set rules, international rules, saying you cannot attack civilian population.
Yeah, that comes from St. Augustine.
And ultimately from St. Augustine.
Yeah, he's heavily quoted by Aquinas, because Aquinas talked about just war theory as well. And he was kind of taking a lot from St. Augustine, one of his most prevalent works being City of God, but other works that he's done as well. And because St. Augustine really laid the groundwork for just war. It's just that it wasn't organized really into a coherent theory
St. Augustine
until much later.
In Catholicism is the first one who uses...
He's still considered, even by secular sources, the father of just war. And St. Aquinas also... And
St. Augustine takes some of the philosophical principles, the philosophy, and uses that philosophical story from and background and heritage from the Romans and the Greeks, and applies that philosophical how to use logic to Christianity. And then it was developed, and he's not the only one, obviously, but even as I mentioned, St. Isidore of Seville, he develops this idea of the law of the people, and they establish certain conditions, and for example, even diplomatic immunity, that we take for granted, but even St. Isidore of Seville, 7th century in Spain, he talks about that. So there is something, even in the School of Salamanca, they talk about homicide. When is it permissible? Is it permissible, and when is it not permissible? Even committing suicide, is it permissible or not permissible? So these are the things that even to this day, we talk about, for example, euthanasia. Nowadays, very current, in some jurisdictions, in some countries, they use a different euphemism, but even the word euthanasia in itself is a euphemism because it means the good death. Well, is it permissible morally or not? And then homicide, well, something that the Catholic Church has always established, you cannot kill an innocent person, but if it's in self-defense, it is permissible, for example. And also, but it's only permissible if, for example, it's done by a judge, on behalf of the state. If you are going to protect the community, so you can kill somebody in self-defense because you are protecting your own person, but also the theologians, they're saying you are allowed to kill somebody who's guilty, who's not innocent, but only a judge might do that. You cannot do it. You cannot say, I'm going to kill that person because he committed a horrible crime, and I'm going to kill them. Or a group of neighbors, we're going to kill that person. And then these theologians say, no, the only person, again, this idea of there is a hierarchy.
Hierarchy of authority.
Authority, and say, no, it's only a judge can do that. Right. Basically, acting on behalf of the
and for good reason too, right? Because if anyone could just take vigilante justice against wrongdoers, then you're going to fall into anarchy quite quickly, because there's no checks and balances, there's no proper ruling due process, really, because that's what it comes down to, and that's something the church has always preached, is the concept of due process. Right. We're not just going to, especially when it comes to talking about the Inquisition, that was a very strict form of due process. They were very precise in their rulings and in making sure that everyone was given a fair trial.
Right. Even to this day, you can go back, which is fascinating. You can go back to those trials, and you can see the whole trial, because they kept records.
That's right.
You had even the habeas corpus. The habeas corpus, we owe that to this understanding, this Catholic understanding, that you cannot just, you have the right to be told what your charge is, and of fair trial, and you have to have witnesses. You can call your witnesses. So these are the concepts that it was developed bit by bit, but it has a moral component. When we say fair trial, well, historically, there is no fair trial. So this idea of morally, you are entitled, because of who you are, the dignity of the person, and fairness and justice. This is a very Catholic understanding of how we deal with each other. Yeah. Some people might disagree, but that's okay. Yeah. But that's why I usually say that Catholics, especially these theologians, they do not have a point of view. They have a vast field of vision that is more than 2,000 years to have an understanding of things. As I said, even to this day, everything we do 4 centuries ago, very much the same. Those relationships, how I interact with you, has a consequence. One of the theologians from the School of Salamanca says, okay, can I charge interest for usury? Because it was debated also in the University of Paris. Somebody who was a trader, a businessman, and he comes across with this issue. And then he goes to the priest and what's the issue? So some of these theologians, they say, no, you cannot charge at exorbitant interest because you are taking advantage, usually. You're taking advantage of somebody. So if I know that you are poor and I'm going to charge you an exorbitant amount of money, 20%, even the credit cards nowadays, they are charging you, basically they are lending you money, but then it's 20%. And also some businesses, private businesses here in this province, if you take a check and you can cash that check, what are they called? They loan day shops. You can go take your check, and it's not a bank, it's not a credit union, it's a private business. They are not regulated by the law, so they are allowed to charge an exorbitant, more than 100% interest. So that's usually, we are here in the 21st century, and this is being allowed. People don't talk about it, but from a moral, ethical point of view, back in the School of Salamanca, they are saying, no, they are exploiting somebody, and that morally is immoral.
And that even goes back to St. Thomas, and who also referenced Aristotle. Aristotle taught in his Politics famously that to use wealth, which is a tool in and of itself, as a means for trade, it's not the end of trade, to use a means of trade to acquire more wealth, so use money to make money, is inherently immoral.
Right.
And St. Thomas echoes that in his Summa.
And then what we are doing now is basically we're facing the same situations, the same dilemmas, and I would ask, again, it's part of this, the School of Salamanca, but in the 21st century right here, is why does the government allow this injustice, exploitation, allowing these businesses to charge usury? So that's the question. Also, when it comes to the School of Salamanca, is the equivalent of nowadays of the think tanks. So nothing has changed. We have rulers, we have governors and governments, at times the cities, the provinces or regions or countries. When they are dealing with a new situation, what do they usually say? We're going to establish a commission or a task force, or we're going to ask this particular think tank or that think tank to give us their advice, their opinion, their expert opinion about how we deal with this situation. Effectively, that's what the School of Salamanca and these theologians in other universities were. They were operating, they were the think tanks of the 15th, 16th, 17th century. And that's effectively what they did. Now, the relevance is crucial because in order to understand, we understand the things we recognize. Once we recognize that the ideas and the dilemmas and issues that we deal with today, there's nothing new under the sun,
that's right,
as the Old Testament says, we can go back to the School of Salamanca, to these theologians, to realize that they were already facing some of the modern dilemmas that we still deal with today.
That's right. Yeah, because even if you go back, the problems that St. Thomas was writing about and codifying in his Summa, he was drawing on the principles that were promulgated by early church fathers like St. Augustine, and of course scriptures. It's like, why do we as Catholics turn to scriptures? Is because even though the world may present us with new problems, the principles stay the same. Morality doesn't change because God doesn't change, and we're operating under God's creation and divine law and natural law, which is constant throughout history. But our job, I guess, as humans is to figure out, with changing circumstances, how do those same principles apply without throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, no, we need to reinvent the wheel and come up with new principles. Every time in history we've tried that, it hasn't gone very well. And so a lot of the problems we have today, I think it would be very wise to turn to the School of Salamanca and a lot of the thinkers there who are drawing on this tradition of history and tried and true moral principles, as opposed to trying to reinvent the wheel and say, well, no, we'll solve all the world's problems if we introduce a carbon tax.
And that those traditions, how they do it, they don't do it, they try to instruct again, from a legalistic point of view, the law, moral point of view, theological point of view, even commercial. So we are dealing with every single sphere of the human endeavor and the human mind. We're talking about morality, theology, philosophy, trade, commerce, the relationships with each other, how we relate to each other, and affects everything, whether it's marriage, because even some of these theologians, they already talk about marriage, when is it permissible to, and even the Catholic Church says, right at the beginning, is that you have to marry, the idea of the marriage, you can only marry one person at a time, unless the other person dies, or maybe there is, the marriage is considered annulled.
Yeah.
But then they say, you as a man and you as a woman, you have the freedom to marry each other. We cannot, nobody, so the church, this understanding of the church, thanks to the church, is like this understanding that nobody can force you, parents cannot force you, the parents do not have the authority, or somebody else do not have the authority to force you to marry this other person. So thanks to the church, they say, when you marry, they say, are you marrying this woman freely? Yes, and to the woman, this idea that you as a woman, because you are, you have free will and you are a creature of God and you have dignity, equally, absolutely. And then they say to the woman, are you marrying this man freely? Mm-hmm. And if they say no, then the marriage is not valid and they cannot proceed. So this idea that we take it for granted. I'm free to marry whoever I want. Well, we owe that to the Catholic Church. This understanding, because in other societies, even to this day, they do not have the freedom to marry.
No, but there was arranged marriages, or women would be sold into marriages. Right. There was all sorts of pretty
and how they deal, whether it was St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine or St. Isidore of Seville and all these theologians, the Augustinians, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Jesuits, they try to instruct these ideas, and based on the use of a particular method is through the instruction, basically through the universities, and also by publishing and debates. So at that time, the School of Salamanca, what they do is not only they are teaching to the students, but then the monarchs and other people are saying, we're dealing with this moral issue, or trading or commerce. How do we approach that? And then they start publishing treaties, manuals, even instructions for confessors, and they establish something else, which is part of the Catholic Church, the disputations, the debates, public debates. Yes. So they invite, nowadays we have the same debates, exactly the same on TV. We are going to have Dr. So-and-so debating, does God exist? Well, they did that already in medieval times. And this
I love how we're regressing back to, very primitive debates today, whereas,
It's the same debate. So they have we have today Dr. So-and-so and Dr. So-and-so. You're going to speak in favor of this, and you're going, and that's how they develop these ideas of saying, you cannot use violence. You are going to convince using logic, using the arguments. You might be mistaken, but at least you can present it. And this is what science and the scientific method developed. It goes back to, even there was a bishop in England in the 12th century who is considered the father of the scientific method for the basic idea of, here are these ideas, we have to prove it. We have to replicate the experiment and then use the logic to see if this is true. If what we're trying to prove is based on reality, and there are facts to prove the theory.
Yeah, and it's actually, I think it's important to note too that the church had forbidden lay people from engaging in debate, oftentimes in public debate, because they were obviously concerned that they would misrepresent the Catholic faith, or even worse, if they didn't know their faith and then they went and debated someone who undermined it, then that could compromise.
Nowadays it's the same. A lay person cannot teach at university.
That's right.
A lay person cannot be a doctor without having the license.
That's right.
There are certain professions that they have the right, the right, again, issued by the state to say, if you are a nurse, or if you are a lawyer, or if you are an electrician, or if you are an engineer, or if you are a professor, you have to have the license, piece of paper saying...
And credibility. Otherwise you end up with the presidential debates that we see in the U.S.
So you have proven that you have studied, you have undertaken the training, and that allows you, and then this institution, this university grants you, or this body, this professional body issues you with a license. So this idea that anybody can debate, well, depends. I mean, yes, if you're on the internet or we're having a discussion, anybody could. But in order to teach, that would be different, because in order to teach, you have to grant the license, the permit, to somebody who can prove that at least they have the background. Even if you call an electrician, they have to have, or an engineer, or you have to have, and even the city will come and make sure that it was done to a standard, and the person had the license to do that. So that's the understanding and the importance of the School of Salamanca, and I think we have done pretty well. Any questions? Any issues?
So I just want a bit of a takeaway here is like what makes the School of Salamanca relevant today, and why should we care? Why would it be worth studying and looking into the School of Salamanca? Because we've talked a lot about what they did. Like, they touched on everything. They touched on laws and morality, theology. I'm pretty sure they had astronomy at a later point. They were talking about. Well,
they study any science. When it comes to the universities and even the Catholic Church, they say any science, any subject, it's can be studied because the Catholic understanding of science and everything is God's creation. So whether you're studying mathematics or the cosmos or physics or chemistry or nature, is trying to figure out where is God as the creation of God. You can study it. And one of the greatest scientists through history,
Darwin.
Well, actually, he was a Christian, and he had a Christian understanding of nature, and then also
that was a joke, by the way.
If you look at, for example, the contribution of some of the clergy, and even the Catholics, and other Christians from different denominations, from the science doesn't contradict faith, and faith doesn't contradict science.
Right.
If science contradicts faith, there's something wrong, and if faith contradicts science, there's something wrong. Yeah. Also, when we talk about when we use the term science, at times we use the word science as a magic wand, or I'm following science. Well,
or like a religion.
Or like a religion. In the 16th century, for example, they believe that the fossils, and this was the consensus, the scientific consensus at that time, according to science, it was the fossils came from the sky, or they were growing just like plants. Until a Jesuit realized, again, looking at science, he realized that, this is different. He was given a shark by some fishermen, and then he had come across the fossil of a shark, the teeth of a shark, and then he's the one who started developing this idea that, no, these fossils are, and the consensus at that time was they came either from the sky or from the like a plant. So when people use the word science, well, strictly speaking, you are trying to prove, again, does it, can we replicate it and we develop? But how do we develop the science? By having debates.
Right.
And then if you have the theory, okay, show it to me. At one point, it has, whether it's mathematics, chemistry, physics, astronomy, the greatest, some of the greatest astronomers were Jesuits, and even seismology, the study of earthquakes, is usually nicknamed the Jesuit science because of the number of Jesuits contributing to the development, especially right at the beginning, of seismology. By 1930, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, had more than 30 different stations, weather stations and seismological stations, analyzing and developing new equipment to deal with the storms and earthquakes. The moon craters, in the moon, there are 30 moon craters named after Jesuits in recognition, honoring their contribution to moon studies and astronomy studies. And this is just one of the examples, but when people say, well, the church has been against science, it's like, no, science wouldn't be science. The history of science without the Catholic Church, without the contribution of the Catholic Church, would be a footnote. The first astronomical observatories, even to this day, there is an astronomical observatory in the Vatican, but the first astronomical observatories, we owe that to the Catholic Church in Europe. The first museums to try to preserve the human knowledge, Catholic Church. In the 16th century, the first public museums, as we understand them today. When you just even Google nowadays, number of contributions of clergy, the clergy, and even Catholics, lay people contributing to science is phenomenal. But this is not a match. This is not like, oh, we are better than you. It's just part of this understanding that we are.
Even if we are.
And then, but I will ask you. Then you will have to qualify that statement, and you will have to prove to me, playing devil's advocate, that the statement. So this idea that we are in the same boat, generally speaking, again, and trying to make sense of reality. So why is it important? Why is the School of Salamanca important? First of all, because knowledge is important. And that's the main motivation with humans, is to try to understand things, to make sense of things. And if we know where the ideas come from, it helps us understanding who we are, where we come from, who we are, the ideas, the dilemmas. And it helps us, it's the same when you are dealing with any problem, even at home, fixing something, mathematical problem or moral problem. If you look at the history, it gives you a better understanding and more chances of finding a solution.
Yeah. So like with the School of Salamanca, the reason that you might want to investigate it more would be if you were looking at, we have a lot of problems in the world today that they've already discussed at great length in the School of Salamanca. So that would be a good place, a good resource to look at in order to gain their insight on a lot of the issues we are still facing today that they've already discussed at great length. And there's a very big wealth of wisdom and knowledge there that maybe if we tapped into, we could...
Huge, right? Because even the number of publications, some of them, again, we talked about Francisco de Vitoria, then there were so many disciples, other professors, what we call now...
But even like something practical like economics, like how do you cultivate a good economic system that produces the most good for the public? Right. And you mentioned that the Austrian School of Economics, that's something that they kind of delved into and in part developed. And
this idea that you cannot exploit and the fair game, the idea of the concept of being fair game, and which is also to do with morality, obviously, because if
justice and mercy, Well,
I would ask those people who are listening to us to invite them to maybe if they're interested, there is a lot, and you can, fortunately nowadays, you can access some of the original writings. Some of them have been translated into English. Most of them they wrote either in Latin, because it was the lingua franca, it was the international language at the time, and some of them wrote in Spanish, obviously. Some of the texts have been translated into English. The sheer volume, for example, Francisco de Vitoria, he deals with, in one of when he deals with one of the issues, he talks about some of the issues by St. Thomas Aquinas from the Summa Secunda Secundae, just a few questions, and it would be the equivalent of, when he talks about, it would be the equivalent of 6,000 pages. So just to show you the sheer volume of knowledge behind these theologians, and the contributions to everything, economy, philosophy, morality, human relations, money, the theory of money, commerce, human rights is huge.
And practical.
Practical.
Yeah,
and I will ask those people watching, well, maybe if they want to delve into that, to look into that more closely, to see how the things that we deal with today, how they were already dealing with at that time, 400 years ago.
Yeah, because even if we can't solve those problems at a big scale, we can start with fixing our own lives first. So,
great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Good conversation on the School of Salamanca.
School of Salamanca.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.